Okay, let's dig into this. We're looking at some source material you shared, and it puts forward a pretty challenging idea.
Mm,
It talks about something that, well, it feels like modern-day slavery, but it's really important to stress this isn't about physical chains or, historical bondage.
exactly. The sources are very clear on that distinction. Historical slavery was physical coercion, denying basic rights. This concept, it's
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
It's described in the material as a system of dependency.
Dependency.
Yeah.
And that dependency, the sources argue, comes from not actually owning things, being sort of pushed into constant subscriptions or financing or renting just to get by, just to access stuff you need.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
So our goal here in this deep dive is really to unpack the specific points and the examples the source material uses.
To see how this idea of dependency through not owning things actually shows up in everyday life.
Yeah, exactly. From like the things you buy all the way to how you make a living. The scientists suggest it's pretty pervasive.
Okay, so let's jump in. The first big theme the sources hit on is this: illusion of freedom.
Mm-hmm. The main claim is that people seem free, right? You can move around, make choices. But the argument goes, you don't truly own things in a way that gives you real independence. You're kind of compelled, as the sources put it, to use or rent or subscribe.
And this really pops when you look at our digital lives, doesn't it? The sources point right at software.
Oh, definitely. Remember buying software like in a box with a disk? You installed it, you owned it.
Yeah, that specific version was yours.
Well, the sources argue that model is pretty much gone for a lot of things. Now, you're often locked into monthly or annual subscriptions,
Mhm.
mandatory ones.
Even for software you mostly use offline,
Right. And the material notes that companies sometimes cite server costs.
which feels a bit strange if you're not primarily online with it. Yeah.
It seems inconsistent sometimes. And it's not just software, is it? Digital content is another big one the sources highlight.
Oh, like movies or music online.
Exactly. You buy it, but what you often get is just online access.
Which means, and the material really flags this risk, if your account gets banned or canceled, poof,
Your whole library can just vanish. No refund, no download usually.
you don't have that physical copy anymore, or even an offline file in many cases.
So it pushes you into just constantly relying on these platforms, these subscriptions. It's not ownership in the traditional sense, according to the sources.
Okay, so that's the digital side. But it's not just digital, right? The sources talk about physical goods, too, property, like phones.
Yes, cell phones are a key example in the material. The argument is that manufacturers inflate prices so much.
That buying one outright is really hard, especially if you're on a lower income.
Precisely. Which, maybe unintentionally, maybe not, pushes loads of people into these long-term payment plans.
And the sources add that the truly cheap phones, they often just don't cut it for what you need a smartphone for today. They're too limited.
Yeah. And this pattern extends way beyond phones. Think bigger. Cars, houses.
Yeah, the source material basically says buying those outright is almost impossible for most people now. Prices are just too high.
Leaving financing, mortgages, as pretty much the only way in.
And the sources even point out that used cars are often so expensive they still need financing. Plus, you've got the high insurance costs piled on top.
So the argument being built in the sources is that accessing even basic stuff, digital or physical, means being constantly tied to debt or recurring payments.
Which definitely makes you question what freedom means in that context.
Right, and that leads directly into the next big area the source material covers. The obstacles to building your own economic path. Independence.
Okay, so shifting from just consuming things to actually like producing or starting something yourself,
Exactly. And the sources lay out some pretty significant hurdles there.
like getting credit, starting a business.
That's a major one. The material goes into the loan requirements. They're described as really stringent.
What kind of thing?
Well, the specifics mentioned are needing a solid credit history, which, if you're younger or have been working lower wage jobs, you might not have had a chance to build,
Okay.
and then needing collateral or guarantees.
Which the sources say is almost impossible unless you've got like family money or you've somehow saved up a ton over years from salaries that the material calls meager.
Yeah. And the sources connect this lack of credit for smaller players directly to less competition internally.
Because new businesses just can't get started easily to challenge the big guys.
That's the argument. Fewer new entrants mean less competition.
And that, according to the sources, is linked to what they call monopolistic pricing.
The idea is that established companies don't face the same pressure to keep prices low, So prices keep going up, sometimes faster than general inflation.
Wow. Okay. So besides the challenge of starting a business, what about just earning a living and having a place to live? The sources talk about wages and housing too, right?
They do, and the point made in the material is pretty stark. For many people, salaries just haven't kept up. They're not enough to actually buy a home.
Which forces huge numbers of people into renting.
Yeah.
Forever, basically. You're paying every month for something you'll never own.
And the sources describe the instability that comes with that. Like one bad break, lose your job, get sick, have a legal issue.
And you could end up homeless really quickly.
Yes, the material presents that as exposing the sort of hidden fragility in the system for many.
They make a comparison, don't they? Something about the past.
Yeah, it's quite striking. The sources mention, for example, a time when maybe a taxi driver could afford to own their cab and their home.
But no, now.
Now, the sources claim wages for many jobs, even something like working in a restaurant, often aren't enough to reliably buy a car, let alone cover rent in a lot of places.
And the cost of just getting into the housing market. The sources mention minimum costs often being, what, hundreds of thousands of dollars?
Yeah, in many areas, it's depicted as just prohibitively expensive.
So even if you are working steadily, the system described in the source material makes achieving that basic stability really, really tough through the traditional routes.
Exactly. And it's not just about your income or getting a loan, the sources argue. There are other things like regulations, lobbying. They add more barriers.
Okay, let's explore that. The material uses an example related to transportation, right? Like ride sharing.
Mm-hmm. It details how individuals trying to use their own car for ride sharing face a whole bunch of restrictions and fees from, like, city or state authorities.
What kind of stuff?
Well, needing special licenses, facing higher tolls, the high cost of gas, obviously, and even big daily rental fees if you don't actually own the car you're driving for the service.
And the sources put special emphasis on needing commercial license plates.
Yes. The material suggests that requirement, possibly pushed by lobbying, effectively locks a lot of people out of being self-employed in that traditional way, like an independent taxi driver might have been.
So the source's argument ties these regulations, plus the difficulty getting credit we talked about.
That it ties them together. And the conclusion drawn in the material is that these factors contribute to what it calls a caste-like society.
Whoa, okay. What do they mean by that?
Well, according to the sources, it means your opportunities are increasingly determined by where you start, rather than it being this land of opportunity where anyone can supposedly move up easily. Social mobility is limited.
That definitely raises questions about the future, especially for people maybe without a college degree. The sources touch on that too, don't they?
They do. And the picture the material paints there is, well, it's concerning. It talks about how hard it can be to get jobs that don't even technically need a degree.
Like the example used is selling shoes.
Yeah. And the sources say people applying for those jobs can get turned down in favor of college grads.
Even if the pay is really low, not enough to live on.
Right. And then the material adds, landlords often won't rent to people with low wages anyway.
Which can lead straight to homelessness or being stuck in really precarious living situations.
Add to that the whole discussion around automation robots potentially replacing lower-skill jobs, which the sources mention.
It starts to look like a really tough outlook for a lot of people from this perspective.
And the sources make a point of saying, look, not everyone is suited for college or wants to be a doctor or engineer,
Yeah. And they contrast it with the past again, suggesting that basic jobs used to allow people to support themselves.
Whereas now the struggle described is sometimes just affording food, basic necessities.
What about technical skills, like trades?
Even there, the sources point out challenges. Graduates from technical schools might struggle to get transport to job sites, or they can't get the credit they need to buy their own tools and equipment.
Plus, the material mentions fewer apprenticeships, the decline in manufacturing jobs. It's like layers of difficulty.
Exactly. It's presented as this sort of compounding effect.
Okay, so if we pull all these threads together from the source material, what's the main takeaway, the big conclusion?
Well, they really hammer home one central problem as they see it.
Which is
A fundamental lack of access to ownership.
ownership of, well, everything we've talked about.
Yeah.
Investments, property, the means to produce things yourself.
Pretty much, whether it's financial assets, a home, or the tools and capital needed to start a business or work independently.
And the sources argue this lack of ownership is what creates so much instability.
That's the core argument. It makes building a stable life, raising a family, securing a future in the way people traditionally think about it, incredibly difficult.
And one final point the material makes is about blame, right?
Yeah, that's quite pointed. The sources suggest the system often tends to blame individuals for their struggles.
Instead of looking at these root causes, this limited access to ownership and opportunity that the material itself is describing. So wrapping up this deep dive into the source material,
Yeah.
we've kind of traced this idea of dependency through lack of ownership.
Yeah, from the digital stuff we use, the physical goods we need, through to the huge challenges